Hey everybody, Drew here with Smokecraft Barbecue, and today I'm going to teach you how to trim a brisket for a KCBS competition. Today, I have in front of me a 20-pound Snake River Farms black grade Wagyu brisket that we're going to be trimming for you. When you go to competition, the grade of meat is super important, and most teams today on the competition circuit are cooking Wagyu. Now, that said, until you're comfortable cooking a prime grade brisket, you don't necessarily want to spend the extra money and jump up to Wagyu. But what is a Wagyu brisket? What am I talking about in terms of grades? Well, the grades, if we flip this piece over here, have to do with the marbling. And as we open this up, we'll see it. The higher the grade of meat, the higher marbled it is. For Wagyu, we have, from Snake River, two grades. You have black and you have gold. Gold is the highest grade that you can get from Snake River Farms. So it'll be the highest marbled brisket. But today we're going to cook a black, and these are fantastic as well. They're just a little bit cheaper, but still turn out a great product. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter what grade of meat you're cooking. It matters how you cook it. But it all starts with the trim. So let's get this thing going. So this is a 20-pounder. And what I'm going to do, I have this awesome Wusthof 6-inch curved boning knife, which is really great to trim a brisket with. But when you open up your brisket packet, always do it from the back side on the fat cap. This way you don't accidentally put a gash into your flat, which you're going to be using for competition. So we're going to go ahead and open it up. Now is the first time we're going to have a chance to really look at this meat. And this over here, I'm going to just move to the side for just a minute, but this is our tray that we're going to put it in. All right. All right, let's take it out of the bag and let's see what we got. Ooh, it's a beautiful big piece of meat here. All right, this is beautiful right here. So right here you can begin to see the marbling on the top of the brisket here through the flat. Remember, a brisket's two muscles, the flat and the point, and the flat is what we're going to be primarily focused on today as part of our competition cook. But it's got a beautiful marble level. So what we do when we compete is we're going to go ahead and split the brisket. We're going to cut it, the point and the flat, the two muscles, apart from each other because we want to cook them separately. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to find along the side here, turn around so you guys can see it, you can see that there's this fat line here and the fat seam. This fat seam here, this is where the flat and the point separate. And we want to go ahead and start separating our brisket. So we're going to kind of take that line and we're going to just begin to slowly work our knife through the brisket. Now, getting this thing started is the hardest part because once you start, you're just going to follow the fat. But we don't want to lose any meat on either side. So we want to try and stay cutting within the fat here. And you can see as we begin to get into it, how it's just pulling along. Now, once you get going here, I always like to lean towards keeping the fat on the point side and pulling away from the point side because I'd rather cut into the point meat than my flat as I begin to separate it. So I flipped it over here, just trying to get a little bit better angle as I pull it apart. And I slowly separate the meat. And I can feel here, this right here, this is all fat right here. Let's take this piece off, or just about all fat, not all of it, but almost all of it. Take that off, just get it out of the way. But you can feel where the point goes right along this fat seam and begin to kind of cut down and along it to help you begin to pull this back. And this is a huge piece of meat, so it's kind of tough to show it as I pull it around. But you can see I'm beginning just to kind of pull it back, separate it slowly, And this is going to take just a minute, But this is a huge piece of meat. It's a very expensive piece of meat, and this is for competition, so we don't want to get it wrong. All right, so here, perfect example. If you get in here, you can see I've begun to hit a little bit of the meat. All right, the good news is because I'm pushing my knife down, that's into my point. Okay, this is the piece of meat that we use for the burn ends, not the flat, which is what we're going to use for our slices. So I'm just going to be cautious and kind of bring the knife back just a little bit, back towards the front. But that way I know I'm beginning to get where I want to be. So let's go ahead and keep trimming here. Now on the other side here on the top, you can see I got into the meat again, but that is the flat, not the point. So I got to dig it a little deeper to try and make sure I get underneath that as I keep going here. Now you can buy briskets that are already split between the flat and the point. Certain purveyors will do that for you. You could ask a butcher to do that for you, but I like doing it myself because I know what I have in terms of my piece of meat. Oh yeah, there we go. So now I'm like splitting it. You can really now begin to see it coming apart. It's beginning to pull apart. And on the bottom side here, this is the point. So we're right where we want to be, not risking getting into the flat. Although right there, although we haven't gotten into it, you can see the flat kind of sticking through. So we're going to take it down just a little bit further to make sure we're not getting into it. The seam is not huge in certain places. You can see how we're just coming across. This has got a nice size point on it. But take your time, separate it properly. All this excess fat we're going to take off anyway. As a Wagyu brisket, there's a lot of marbling here, and we want to help render it all down eventually. So we're going to remove most of it from both sides. All right. You can see it just coming apart. I'm right on that seam on the point here. Get a little dangerously close there to that flat. But we're getting to the end of the point. So now let's flip it over. We're beginning to see where we're coming to on the end here. And there's a certain point where, no pun intended, where you have to just begin to cut it across. You know, we've gotten a huge piece of meat here, and it does start to end. So being careful not to do what I just did and cut into the bottom of the flat, we're going to kind of start ending our cut here. And start bringing it across. Having a good sharp knife really helps with this. All right, there it is. So right here, I'm going ahead and start to come across here, and you can see there's just a little bit of point meat, but it really is the end. So now I'm just going to go ahead and take it across the top carefully, pulling it away to make sure I'm not getting into the flat meat underneath it. You can see it's all just fat right here. And there we go. We're done separating. So this is the point that we're going to cut up into our burn ends right here. It's a huge point. Lots of great meat to choose from here. Just put it to the side. And this right here, this is the flat. And look how great this is. This is a huge piece of meat. And this will give us a lot of options. Okay? But let's go ahead, flip it over first and foremost. Now, when we're cooking a brisket, you're going to want to slice it the same way as, or across the marbling. So our marbling's right here. So when we're looking at how we're going to cut this and trim it for competition, we want to focus in on this area here so we can go slices just like this across the grain. That gives us that perfect pull and texture at the end. Now, the challenge is, this is a huge piece of meat. At competition, you have to fit your brisket into a 9x9 box. So a board like this, and this disposable cutting board is fantastic because this happens to have marks on it, and underneath here it shows the size of a competition box. This is what we have to put our meat inside a competition box, so we can use that as measurements to help us. So as I begin to look at how much of this brisket I can use, I need to start thinking about how I'm going to shape it to my box. I want to trim it to my box shape before I cook it, so I'm not trying to cut it at the end. And I don't want to cook any meat that I don't need to cook because it will lengthen the total cook time. So, and it's stuff that we're not going to use anyway. If we're able to round this out and get the sides, we'll be able to get seasoning on all the sides and get a perfect rounded piece of brisket. So basically, as I look at this, we kind of have from here to here to work with. And then width-wise, we're going to need to cut some of this off to fit within the sides of the boxes. It begins to kind of get thin right about here. So I can look at cutting it here, and on this side, same thing, it gets a little thin around here. So we'll start beginning to trim down on the sides and move this stuff off, and then take a look at where we are. So, and this also gives us a first chance to really see some of the great marbling inside the meat, because now we're cutting into what we're cooking. And look at that. That marbling level inside this flat is just absolutely insane. It's just so much marbling. And this is a black grade brisket. Imagine how much more there is when you're working with the gold grade briskets. So I've got my side here. I'm looking at it. I've got a little bit of flat, but let me take off on the thickness isn't great. So let me start taking off here, and we'll decide which way we want to keep going with this. And again, I'm slicing down the side right where I want to be with the box, and staying with the grain. So we're getting it straightened out. Man, look at that. See, now you can even see that marbling even better. Now this side's a little bit thicker, which is great. So we're going to leave this side, and we're going to start trimming in on this side since we got a thick side of our flat right here. And we're just going to save this meat for right now. So now I'm going to go ahead and try and keep this thing straight based off of where the marbling is, and I'm going to start putting it kind of in line here for just a second. So I got to start coming over and trimming on this side here, bring it in just a little bit, try and keep my brisket as straight as possible here as I do this. All right, just begin to get inside the box, and you can see I got a little point here, so I need to straighten this out on this side right here. Okay, now we're beginning to get our shape that we want. Now I'm going to bring back up here this rack. This right here, this is a Wolf's Tray from 270 Smokers, and what the Wolf's Tray is, an elevated Wolf's Tray, and it has these side panels that are called the bus racks, and this is going to help us keep our brisket shape as we cook it. So it fits on an elevated, it's elevated on the bottom, so it sits in a pan, not on the bottom, lets stuff go down in between, and a brisket tends to expand width-wise as it cooks, and this is going to help it not do that. It's going to help keep our shape. So as I'm looking at our brisket here, I want to make sure I got the right width, and I've already taken these, the rails, which pop off, and I've made sure that I'm at the right width for my box. Okay, so now as I'm looking at my brisket, I want to make sure that my brisket will fit inside of these rails because that's what we're going for. So we're going to just make sure that we got the right width. If we got to trim it a little more, then we got to trim it just a little bit more, but we want it right inside. And look at that. We're pretty much right where we want to be. That's actually pretty darn close to perfect. So maybe trim up just a little bit on the side here, but it's pretty darn close to perfect because when we inject the brisket, it's going to expand a little bit, and that will help it with its shape as well. All right, so we know we're pretty darn close to perfect. Just going to cut this edge right here in terms of our width. All right, we're going to just put this back to the side for a second since it's rattling. Now what I got to do is, obviously, we got the right width. We've got some nice thick meat. But now we got to go ahead and start shaping this out to cook in the smoker. We want our brisket to look like a sports car. Nice, clean, aerodynamic. So we're going to go ahead, and I'm going to go ahead and start curving around here because this point is not going to cook very well right here. So you can see how I just kind of begin to mark where I'm going here. I'm going to go ahead and just start rounding it right along the edge here to help begin creating that aerodynamic space. We're going to lose a little bit more of this brisket. Okay. Now I'm going to do the same thing on this side. And again, I don't want to lose it. I want to lose as little as I can here. But this part here is obviously, this has been steamed. This is part of the cut, you know, at the packing house. So I got to cut that off regardless because that's not going to cook well. And then we're going to lose as little as we can here. And I'm going to just try and just curve it just a little bit off the top right here to give myself as many options as I can within this brisket without taking away too much. Okay, so this is beginning to look like my piece of meat right here. I'm going to save all that for later. All right, so we're almost done. We're almost there. So you can see when you look at the brisket, it's kind of like not level, right? We've got a little higher here, a little lower here. This just has to do with this different amount of fat that's on the back because I haven't really trimmed it off yet. So first thing what I'm going to do while I got the front here is using my hand as leverage. I'm going to pop underneath, cut with the grain, begin to take some of this off the top, some of this fat. I'm not worried about the silver skin necessarily underneath it, but this thick, chunky fat, this has got to go because that's just not going to eat well, not going to cook well. But you don't want to find yourself digging in to try and dig out of something. All right, you want to try and stay as close to the surface as you can, not to create any divots along the way. You will have a fat line or a fat seam like this one here on almost every brisket. Depending where it is, sometimes it's pretty prominent. This is where using the bus rails on the Wolf's tray will help keep your brisket in shape and it won't split as it cooks. So we're going to go ahead and just get this off. Get this fat off right here. Just raise it up, use your hand. All right. That's pretty good. I don't think we need to do a whole lot more here at the moment. But we're going to go ahead and focus. This part right here is the highest, and that part's the highest. So we're going to flip over now, and you can see it on the back. You can see you got a big fat chunk here, and this is the last part of the point here. So we're going to go ahead and start just taking this down. And we're just trying to get into the fat only. We're not trying to get into the meat, unless we absolutely have to try and level it. But there are other tricks if we get that far, which I'll show you. We're going to go ahead and just cut down, begin to level it out. I'm not worried about the thickness so much on the fat on the back. You know, if you're cooking a backyard brisket, you know, we talk about how you want to have a 1/4 inch of fat on the fat cap. On the competition brisket, it doesn't matter so much because at the end, we're going to cut the fat off the bottom because the judge doesn't want to eat any fat. So it doesn't matter so much how much you leave. It's more important that you have a level brisket to cook, and so that you get a nice level piece of meat as you do it. So you can see I'm just beginning to try and look at it, shape it. Look like I'm going to be a little low in the middle part here because there's not as much fat here. So we're going to just try and keep taking it off as best we can to level it out. without getting all the way through. It still looks like we're going to have no choice here but to try and balance it out from using one of our tricks. So you guys get to see it firsthand. All right, take off this meat right here that we don't have to worry about. That's the end of the point. So that is just the end of that point meat where we cut it across. Okay. We don't have to worry, again, too much about getting all the way to the meat there, because we're going to cut off the fat anyway at the end. Okay. All right, so let's flip it back over. Let's see how it looks. See, it looks so much more level now. You don't have those huge divots that we had before where one side was above the other. It's actually pretty darn close to good. But I am going to do something to help it out here as we put it in the thing. But last thing I'm going to do, though, is I have a really sharp knife here. I want to trim these edges and round it. Right now, if you look at them, they're very, very stiff. It's almost like a 90-degree angle on these edges because of how sharp the knife was and where it's cutting. And that is going to create it's going to crumble when I slice it after I cook it. So I want to round it so the air just goes right over it. Again, think sports car, think aerodynamics. The smoke wants to roll right over this brisket. So we're going to take our blade and we're going to cut almost at a 45-degree angle and just put a little bit. You see what I'm doing right here? I'm just kind of rounding that edge. Now that same edge, other than that one spot right there, that same edge is now nice and rounded for that airflow to go by. So we're going to go all the way around the brisket and just round our edges. Nice and easy. Okay. And it's most important on the sides right here. This very end piece is good to do it too, but we are not going to use the first couple slices of the brisket to turn in most likely. So we're going to go ahead and just kind of begin rounding it. Try and get it all the way across. So it's got that perfect level. You can do this with scissors as well. Some people find scissors are easier, but I got a really sharp knife, so I don't see a reason to dirty up a second utensil here. Okay, and same thing here. I'm just going to round this corner just a little bit more on the edge so it's nice and smooth all the way around. Cut off those couple funky pieces right there. Just carefully. Yeah, there we go. All right, so brisket edges are all done. It's nice and level. We've got a really good piece of meat here, really nice thick flat. This is going to cook really nicely. All right, so now last thing we're going to do here, and then we're going to get into the point in just one second. I'm not going to touch the back of this brisket again when I season it. So I am now going to go ahead and get it into my pan using the Wolf's tray from 270 Smokers. And I'm going to go ahead and what I want to do is I'm a little worried the middle here is just a little bit depressed. It's not depressed very much, but just a little bit. So I'm going to take one of these scrap pieces of meat here that I cut off earlier, and I'm going to kind of just place it. Well, I don't really like that. I'm going to place it underneath here. I might have to adjust it just a little bit, but there we go. But that way I got a nice smooth surface. If anything, I got a little bump right there in the middle, just so any liquid will drain right off of it. And you can run a whole piece all the way down, depending on what you want to do. So something like this is a little bit thinner piece, so this I'm gonna just cut off that fat. So it might be too high, but this will just give us, if I take that out, put something like that right down the middle. There we go. Now you can see it's got just a nice little curve right there, keeping it all there. We don't have a part that's too high. Any liquid, which is going to come right off the side. So that's going to stay underneath it now the whole cook. And I'm going to take this, I'm going to put it into my Wolf's pan, or into the bus, using the bus rails on the Wolf's tray, which is elevated again, so anything will drip off of it. But you can see it fits perfectly inside here. So now, as I come in to inject it, it's going to hold its shape through the whole cook, and I don't have to worry about the shape, and it's going to be fantastic. So we're going to get into that in just a minute, but we're going to take a quick break, and I'll be right back, and we're going to go ahead and get the burnt end side of this brisket ready to go as well. So now that we've trimmed our flat, we're going to go ahead and get into the point. You can see we got all this meat to the side here, which we're going to deal with in just a minute. But the point, this is the part that we're going to use for burnt ends, okay? We've got a lot of meat here, and you can see it's very, very thick on one side and very thin on the other side. How we trim this down now is going to help us at the end of our cook when we're trying to cut the pieces at the very end. So first thing we're going to do, this is a Wagyu brisket, so all this excess fat is going to go. So you can see over here, this is all just fat right here. There's no real meat. So that's an indicator where we got to cut and start. And we got to take this part off here. It's all fat. Now, judges don't like fat on their burnt ends. The challenge with the burnt end is always rendering it and rendering it down. So now you're going to notice I'm not concerned about digging into meat at this point as much because as soon as I get the fat off, I'm going to start trimming and thinning the pieces of meat out. But let's get that fat off first. Get down to the meat, see how far we got to go. Just begin to take it off. And again, this is all floppy fat. There's no meat here. So I'm going to go ahead and just cut it off at the end. There's nothing to cook, nothing to eat when it's all cooked. Now I got to take off this side over here. Again, this part's the part that's been steamed by the packer. Oh man, now you really can begin to see all that marbling that's here in the point. If you look at that marbling and how much fat there is right here, that just shows how well this is going to cook down. Now, one of the challenges a lot of teams have when they're cooking burnt ends using a gold grade brisket is there's almost too much fat, and it makes it near impossible to cut down. So if you're cooking a prime or black grade brisket, you're going to have a better shot to get fully rendered burnt ends out of it. So that will be our hope using this brisket today, to get those great burnt ends that are just such great goodies at the end. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and flip over. All this fat on the back here, all of it's got to go. None of it, unlike a brisket you're cooking at in the backyard, needs to stay on here because, again, there's so much intermuscular marbling that we don't need to protect the meat, and we want it all to render down. So let's get as much fat off here as we can, because then we can determine how much of the meat, if any, we're going to need to trim off. You can see how much fat was just sitting on top here. These paper towels are just excited here. They're wanting to get after it. Now, it's always best to trim a brisket when it's cold. If you trim it when it's hot, on a hot day outside in the sun, the fat is gonna be a lot harder to work with. So always try and have your brisket as cold as you can as you get started here. All right. Try and get this last layer of fat off here. And again, we don't want any of it because we don't want any fat in the that's going to make a bad bite for the judges. You see this stuff is hard fat. Even with the sharp knife, it's challenging me just a little bit here. All right, so now the back end of this brisket, now we got all this. This is just all fat right here. So all this is just, there's nothing here to save. It's all fat. So let's get rid of it. You can see how much fat is on this brisket. All right, so now if you look at the brisket, you can begin to see you have a thick side and a thin side. And obviously when we're cutting burnt ends, we want nice, even, uniform pieces. So to help our cooking process, we're gonna start cutting down the meat just a little bit, so it's more uniform towards the middle. And again, this is gonna look, we're gonna cut off these thin parts here on the end. And that's about as far as we're gonna go, because now all the way across even, we have that nice even size for our burnt end to cut. Now we want that same thickness all the way on the top here. So we're gonna begin to shave it down and come across. Now, if you're cooking in the backyard, you're not gonna wanna do this. You wanna save all this great point meat. But for competition, for the end, you're gonna wanna take this down just to make your life easier at the end, because if you have to cut this off at the end, you lose the great bark that you're trying to create for a burnt end. So go ahead, take it down. Go ahead, cut this side because it's all fat. Yeah. Get that out of there. Man. All right. And now you can see I'm pretty flat and even across the point. So I got a nice even piece. So make my life a lot easier to work with it here at the end. And I'm just gonna clean up just a little bit more of this fat right here. Get as much of it off as I can. Okay. Now, unlike the flat, I'm not as worried about the edges on this because I'm going to cut into it, and I'm probably going to use my burnt ends are going to come from this middle section right here that I'm going to use. So I'm not as worried about the edges right now. I will just cut that part because it's not going to cook evenly. But I don't need to worry so much about rounding. I'll do it anyway. But it's ultimately not going to be as important because we're not most likely going to use these outer edges. We're going to be looking for these middle pieces. So there we go. Got a nice flat piece, and I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna put that on top of a rack, sitting inside a half pan. Sit that in there, and there we go, folks. And then all this leftovers, I'm gonna save this. This is really great meat. I'm gonna grind it up later, and I'm gonna either make some sausage, maybe a burger, but this is really great Wagyu. You don't want to just throw this out. There you have it, folks. We've come down from a 20-pound Snake River Farms brisket, black gray brisket, to this is what we're now gonna cook for the competition. We got a really beautiful flat, and we've got our point here for our burnt ends. Well, there you have it. That is a trimmed competition brisket ready to go. I hope you all learned something today. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe this video below to see more great videos from us here at Smokecraft. If you guys are interested in purchasing a 270s Wolf tray to go ahead and get yourself set up for your next brisket cook, you can do so by finding the link in the description below. Make sure you stay tuned, watch the next round of videos so we can show you how we're gonna finish this off for our competition. We'll see you next time.